Karahan Tepe and the Cosmic Serpent with Andrew Collins. You are listening to Brothers of the Serpent podcast.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, angels and demons and monsters and serpents. This is Brothers of the Serpent podcast, and we are coming to you not live from the 10 by 10 by 10 Tangent Cube of Science, where we are nestled amongst the dusty bones of an ancient seabed high atop the Edwards Plateau. And this week we have a very special guest joining us from across the pond in the UK, Mr. Andrew Collins, author of many books. He's studied Gobekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe a lot. We're going to talk about that today. And actually, he was recommended by Hugh Newman, which we were hanging out with last time we were in the UK. And he was like, you got to talk to Andrew. And we agreed. And so here we are. Andrew is on the show. Thanks for coming on, man. Thank you very much.
Well, good day to you, gentlemen. You're in Texas, I believe. And
That's
I'm
right.
Just outside of London, where it's a pretty cold, miserable night. But that's why I'm wearing the hat. And I may even put some gloves on a little later. We'll see what happens.
Oh man, is it that cold in your place there?
Well, we just had Storm Dara hit at the UK yesterday, and I think it's basically over now. But it sort of stopped football matches, and bridges were closed, and sadly somebody was killed, and so it's really heavy wind stuff, and it was bitterly cold at the same time. So I was quite happy to try and go from my car to my house and get inside, basically. But it's like that there. I'm sure it's not like that where you are.
No, it's. I mean, we had some rain yesterday, but it's not that cold. Not at all.
It's like in the 40s Fahrenheit.
Yeah, 40s Fahrenheit. Yeah. So
I think it's 30s. Yeah.
Kyle and I have been really interested in Gobekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, obviously, because this is like one of the. I mean, it's the oldest evidence for any kind of construction. Like, especially the megalithic construction, like a concerted construction effort that took lots of people, and took many, many years. And we've visited it. We've made some videos about it, but I think you have some interesting takes on it. So do you want to basically let's start with how did you get interested in this kind of thing? And then we'll go from there.
Well, I mean, how did I get interested? Well, from a child, I was always interested in the strange, dark and mysterious, as it were. Whether it be ghosts, UFOs, astral projection, dreams. And I sort of followed that up with reading pulp paperbacks at a very early age. And that sort of eventually led me into what's known as the Earth Mysteries, which was basically the whole idea that the megalithic structures of the landscape were in patterns like ley lines, and the energy flowed between them, that the ancients had this understanding of geometry, metrology, built into the design, which was like some kind of lost megalithic science. Books by people like John Michel, inspired me. But I also, at the same time, was reading books by Eric von Daniken. Was God an astronaut? Chariots of the Gods being the most obvious title. And I mean, the thing that type of book did was made you think. It made you think, well, what if there was some kind of higher intelligence involved with the rise of civilization, or the creation of monuments like the Great Pyramid or the Nazca Lines or anything like this? And, so that sort of spurred me on, really. But I mean, I wrote various books which were all about something that I call psychic questing, which is basically working with psychics out in the landscape, discovering artifacts, fighting off black magicians and all sorts of weird stuff like that for years. But finally, I was sort of ready to start writing sensible books. And the first book that I wrote was From the Ashes of Angels, that came out in 1996. And basically what this did was to look at all of the stories to do with the foundation of civilization, which occurred, we now know, in southeastern Turkey, and to connect them with stories, myths and legends to do with wisdom bringers, mythical beings that came onto the scene and were said to have provided the rudiments of civilization to mortal kind. Now, we're talking about the Watchers of the Book of Enoch, and their offspring, of course, the Nephilim. We're talking about the Annunaki in Mesopotamian tradition, and other similar examples in the myths of other surrounding countries, like in Iran, for instance. There's the story of the Immortals. The Immortals were said to be like these sort of like godlike individuals who helped humanity, became the ancestors of the earliest kings and whatever. They too, passed on the rudiments of civilization. And it became clear that all of this had occurred in the same area, the area that is traditionally known as the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden, although it might be seen as a mythical location, it's not. I mean, it was a geographical location. It's mentioned in the Bible on a few occasions, and it can quite easily be pinned down to southeastern and also to eastern Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. And I'll tell you for why. Because it's said that the 4 rivers of paradise flow out of the Garden of Eden, or the terrestrial paradise. And they can easily be identified as 4 real rivers. That's the Euphrates, the Tigris, the Greater Zab, which eventually flows into the Tigris when it reaches Iraq, and also the Artsis River, which flows eastwards into the Caspian Sea. Those are the 4 traditional rivers of paradise, and they all rise in eastern Turkey, in an area called the Armenian Highlands, which is on the northern part of the country. So we've got a geographical area, and what I suggested was that these watchers, these Nephilim, the Immortals, the Annunaki, are a memory of those that gave humanity the rudiments that allowed the technology and innovation to create what's known as the Neolithic Revolution. And I pinpointed this as occurring somewhere, as I said, in southeastern Turkey. And this book came out in 1996. It was a bestseller in the Times newspaper, and also on top of that, it started to cause a bit of a controversy. Not just in this country, but also in Turkey, which is mainly featured, but we'll come on to that. But what happened was that eventually it was published in a Turkish language edition in 2002. And this allowed me to go out in 2004 to see these sites that I've been writing about. Now, I knew nothing about Gobekli Tepe when I wrote From the Ashes of Angels. But as I was writing that book, I was aware. Sorry, hold on. Sorry, somebody's trying to ring me. I'm just sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
I apologise. Right, hopefully it won't happen again. Throw that away. Sorry. Right, now I wasn't aware of the existence of Gobekli Tepe when I wrote From the Ashes of Angels. But what I didn't realise is that as I was writing that book in the dark winter nights of 1995, is that during the day, the first spades were going into the ground at Gobekli Tepe. And this would not be revealed to the world until the year 2000. And then there was a huge spread in a German magazine, which somebody drew my attention to. And I looked at that and I said, well, there you go. There's your smoking gun, if you like, of everything that I've written about, because it's very clear that there's a culture here, a society, a tiered society, a structure which would have involved hundreds of thousands of people, creating these incredible stone enclosures with their T-shaped pillars, each of which are carved either with animals or with anthropomorphic features, like human-like features. And it was right in the area. And what's so interesting is that the person that actually discovered Gobekli Tepe, Klaus Schmidt, who I met on a few occasions before he sadly passed away in 2014, is that he wrote a book in 2012 where he actually states, about Gobekli Tepe, or actually states that he believed that the pillars were the ancestors of those that created Gobekli Tepe, and that they were the Annunaki of Mesopotamian tradition. Now, he doesn't call them Annunaki. What he calls them is the Annuna. The Annuna is the original Sumerian term for the Anunnaki, and it's a word meaning something like of the sky or possessed of the sky. And you could break that down quite simply into the sky people. And I mean, some people might want to see this as further evidence that the Annunaki are space beings that came down here, but I don't think so. I think what you're looking at here are flesh and blood beings that gave us the rudiments of civilization. I mean, for instance, it says that the Annuna gave us sheep and grain. Sheep and grain is clearly a metaphor for animal husbandry and agriculture, particularly the domestication of wheat, which we know took place for the first time in the area of Gobekli Tepe. Plus, it said that they helped us create the first cities, which obviously would become those of Samaria, in Iraq, or Sumer in Iraq. It's said that we also worked with them to create the first irrigation ditches. So in other words, that's obviously part of the whole farming system. And just things like this, made it clear that we're dealing with flesh and blood human beings. But then if you come on to the Watchers were said to be able to lay with mortal women, who then produced giant-size offspring that were named Nephilim. And that they ran amok, and that the Watchers that were still loyal to heaven rounded up the Nephilim, killed them all, although they clearly weren't all killed because they appear later on in the Bible. And that the rebel Watchers were supposedly rounded up and put in prison. Now, obviously we're seeing this through the lens of, Hebrew peoples, Semitic peoples, that probably originated in the area of southeastern Turkey. I mean, that certainly was the original language that was spoken in that area, which was Akkadian, which was the language that would eventually be adopted in Sumer and combined with Sumerian to form the Sumero-Akkadian language, which most of the texts that we know were all created originally in this language. So I think that what we're seeing in all of these myths and legends is a memory of the prime movers behind the construction of Gobekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, sites which I've been going to, since that time. I mean, in 2004, for instance, I got to see Gobekli Tepe for the first time. And whilst I was in the area, I was told about the existence of this new site called Karahan Tepe, and I was shown a picture of a stone, a T-pillar, and it had this snake crawling up the side of it. And I realised that this was clearly part of the same culture as Gobekli Tepe. So I thought, I've got to find it. Now, all I knew is that it was in a remote region about 25 miles away from Gobekli Tepe called the Tek Mountains. So I was there a couple of days later with a driver and interpreter, and nobody anywhere seemed to know where this site was until finally we spoke to this guy in complete Arab dress. Bear in mind, this is very near the Syrian border, and driving a tractor, and he just sort of pointed. So we went in the direction he pointed. We eventually came across this farmhouse, and a little boy came out, spoke to our interpreter, and just pointed south, and there was a hill, limestone, north-south orientated hill. We walked towards that, and I started to see flint tools, stone tools on the ground. And the closer we got to this hill, the more there were, until eventually there were hundreds of them all over the place. It's clear that there'd been incredible amount of activity, and I recognise the style as meaning that whatever was going on here had to be at least 10 to 11,000 years old. And also what you had was these right-angled pieces of what are known as porthole stones, just beautifully carved, looking like something from a medieval window.
Oh, yeah.
Just lying about here and there from, now lost enclosures. And also on top of that, you had just sticking out of the hard soil and rubble at the base of the hill and on the side of the hill itself, and even going up to the top of the hill, what were quite clearly T-pillars. And these T-pillars were like those at Gobekli Tepe, not so big, I must point out, But it was clearly, once again, part of the same culture. So it was clear that somewhere underneath this sort of rubble was a complex that was similar to Gobekli Tepe. And I continued to go there, year after year after that, eventually, obviously, with Hugh Newman and his partner, J.J. Ainsworth. And we covered every single part of this. We went into every hole, climbed every hill, looked as far as we possibly could for evidence of human activity. And then in 2018, we learned that the place was about to be surveyed in preparation for full excavations that would begin the following year in 2019. And that was it. But of course, I didn't get out there the following year. And then obviously all the lockdowns happened. But in 2021, it was announced what they'd actually discovered. And when I saw the pictures, I thought, oh my God. It was like a lost city that they'd now uncovered. In fact, I call it the lost city of the Annunaki, because I think that's exactly what it is. This is what you've got there. It's 11,500 years old. It was built right at the end of the last ice age. It's contemporary with Gobekli Tepe, clearly part of the same culture, but something different was going on at Karahan Tepe, something much deeper, much rawer, and I would even say much darker, because you've got structures that are actually cut out of the bedrock itself, that are dropped down. One, for instance, which we call the Pillar Shrine, which is actually structure AD, has these 10 pillars coming vertically out of the ground that cut out the bedrock themselves, and out of the wall facing into the hill, you have this oversized human head, which is probably about 3 times the size of a normal human head, and it's on the end of a long serpentine neck. The whole thing looks like something out of Beetlejuice, to be honest. It is a very, very peculiar carving to do. And the fact that the head is so large is just extraordinary. And you have to start asking yourself, what was going on here? Well, obviously, you got the Brothers of the Serpent, and the serpent seems to be the most important symbol at this site. Not only was it there on that original picture of the stone that I saw, which, by the way, has now disappeared. I don't know whether it eventually went into a museum or was stolen or whatever. I don't know. But certainly it appears on various other stones now. It's on the side of benches. It's carved into the bedrock. And even at least 2 of the actual enclosures that have been carved out the bedrock, I think, actually are the heads of snakes. In other words, they're the hollow 3D representation of snakes' heads. I've overlaid them with a local snake called the Anatolian meadow viper, very poisonous snake indigenous to the Tek Mountains, and it fits perfectly. And it's even possible that these vertical pillars coming out of the ground are meant, certainly in abstract form, to represent the fangs of the actual snake itself. These pillars do look a bit phallic, yes, you have to admit that, but I don't necessarily think that was their primary symbolic function. I think that it was a much higher concept than that.
Were we told?
Plus, we also know that these structures are aligned towards the solstices. Hugh Newman's probably talked to you about the incredible discovery that he made of this this shaft of light coming in through the porthole stone into the Pillar Shrine and hitting this giant stone head at the time of the winter solstice. I was there in 2022. I witnessed it twice on 2 different days. I was able to sit right in front of it as all this was happening and record it. And this is an incredible thing, because you watch it and it's only on the head that it hits. And we know that in 9000 BC, when this enclosure was constructed, that the sun would have been just slightly down a bit, to do with the movements of the Earth in its relationship to the axis. And therefore, this alignment would be even better. It would have fully illuminated the head itself. Plus, I separately found that another one of the enclosures there, structure AA, which we call the pit shrine, because it's got this huge, weird pit right in the centre of it, cut out the bedrock. That's aligned to the summer solstice, not the winter solstice, but the summer solstice at sunset. In other words, as the sun hit the horizon, this particular enclosure would be directly facing towards it, and you'd have been able to just stand in it and look directly at that. But this is where it starts getting interesting, because if you continue to remain in that enclosure for another 2 hours, when it gets dark, you'd have seen an incredible sight, because at the exact spot that the sun itself had just disappeared below the horizon, you would have seen the Milky Way stretching vertically upwards, right in the middle of which was this dark area known as the Dark Rift. And right at the base, as it's just gradually setting at that moment, you have what's known as the galactic bulge. The galactic bulge is the center of our own Milky Way galaxy. And of course, if you think of the Milky Way, it encircles our world, and was obviously known and revered in the past. It was much brighter, and the brightest part of it was the galactic bulge. And this is significant because this was seen in the past as the head of a creature whose body would be the actual Milky Way itself. And very often this was seen as a snake or a serpent. And this is reinforced in the area of Gobekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe in the fact that sorry, lost my train of thought for a second. Whoops, that's weird. Right, so yes, okay. So basically, this is the Cosmic Serpent. The Cosmic Serpent is the Milky Way. The head of the serpent is the galactic bulge itself, which in the past would have been much brighter than it is today.
You think this could be the oldest Ouroboros, right? If it's the head.
It is the Ouroboros.
Yeah, it goes all the way around and it's eating itself, so it's, Cosmic Serpent.
It's what we call the world encircling snake, or world encircling, and it was seen to exist beyond the physical landmass, which presumably in the past they were only aware in theory of one landmass. But obviously they weren't stupid. They knew that waters were beyond that landmass. So they thought that this snake existed in what's known as the cosmic ocean. In other words, where our ocean basically became a part of the sky itself, the snake existed in that. I mean, one of the most obvious examples of this is the Midgard serpent in Norse tradition.
Yes.
This is shown coiling around the huge tree called the Yggdrasil, which is an ash tree, which has its top branches in the sky world, its base of the trunk in the middle world, and the roots are in the lower world or the underworld. And around the middle, you see the great snake curling, the Midgard serpent. This is a typical example of this, but these ideas are found all over the world. I mean, they're found in Mesopotamia, they're in Turkey, they're in India, they're in North America, Central America, South America. I mean, this is a universal concept. And I am pretty certain that what was going on at Karahan Tepe was communication via shamans with this Milky Way serpent, and particularly the head, because the head was seen as the soul, the spirit of it. And what's so interesting is that the stars of the constellation of Scorpius, almost seem to come out the mouth of this head of this serpent, almost as if they represent the forked tongue, or the active spirit, or the words coming out of it. And therefore, I think that this is one of the reasons why Scorpius itself not only became a scorpion. I mean, various cultures obviously recognized it as a scorpion, but many cultures also recognized it as a snake. I mean, even the serpent mound in Adams County, Ohio, has been interpreted as an earthen representation of the constellation of Scorpius in its form as a serpent or a snake. These are universal ideas, and I think this is what was going on at Karahan Tepe. The bigger question is, what were they really up to? I mean, okay, they may have believed this, but is that what was really happening? Did they truly believe that there was some kind of higher intelligence that they could communicate with via the galactic bulge? And what's so interesting there is that, yes, it is the center of our own Milky Way galaxy. And the ancients were definitely aware that this area of the sky was very, very important in the past. But on top of that, free thinkers like Rupert Sheldrake has written a paper actually suggesting that the supermassive black hole at the center of our Milky Way galaxy could be not just sentient, but a cosmic being in its own right, one that would be almost recognized as a sort of localized form of God, a God that protects its own, if you like. In other words, all of the matter that has been created within the galaxy itself. So, I mean, these are incredible concepts. And I think that at Karahan, we've got some, whether it be purely intuitive or knowing understanding of the sky and this want to connect with this cosmic source, this creator of the universe itself.
I know. Cool. Yeah, he has. I remember hearing Sheldrake talk about the possibility of the sun being a conscious being. I hadn't known that he suggested maybe the black hole. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I like that.
Well,
that's amazing.
The paper that he wrote about the sun being a conscious being, that's got all the stuff in it about the supermassive black hole being conscious being as well.
Wow. Yeah, it could be, absolutely. I mean, consciousness, if consciousness is a fundamental part of the universe, then something like a supermassive black hole would have a whole lot of it in there, right? It's basically concentrated. So that's really interesting. Yeah. I do have some questions though about the concept of this area being the Garden of Eden. I find this fascinating. So I have some questions about that. But first, I want to ask so we are also really interested in the civilizer gods, these, the Annunaki, the Viracochas of South America.
Yeah.
What do you think of this idea that they're part of a lost, like a collapsed civilization? Like, do you think that's what happened? That they have come to this area to sort of try to rebuild something? Or do you think that they're actually becoming civilizer gods at the time? Or are they trying to teach people? Like,
well, I mean, this all comes down to speculation
more
than anything else, because, we haven't got the anatomical evidence to back up any of this ultimately. So it just becomes a hypothesis. And the hypothesis of Graham Hancock, for instance, is that there was a lost civilization. It reached a high point at the time of the last ice age, and was destroyed in a cataclysm, one which we identify today with the so-called Younger Dryas event, which was a 1,200-year mini ice age that went from 10,800 down to 9,600, which is the exact date when Gobekli Tepe was founded. So, in other words, it was wiped out in this window of 1,200 years. Now, obviously, we are still looking for the smoking gun, if you like, of that lost civilization. But with me, I see things slightly differently. I mean, I don't evoke ideas like Atlantis to answer everything, which I think some of my colleagues firmly do. I don't think you actually need, the idea that there was some kind of, super civilization that got wiped out in the last ice age, because the evidence can come from our distant cousins, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and possibly even other types of early humans that coexisted with anatomical modern humans like ourselves for quite a long period of time. I mean, perhaps as much as 150,000 years, until eventually our contact with them, particularly in areas like Siberia, Mongolia, led to their demise, whether this was, through our actions or climate or whatever, we don't know. But that the legacy of these people was lived on within us. Basically, we carried not only their genes, but also the legacy of all of their achievements. And I mean, for instance, the Denisovans, who we now know probably inhabited for the most part, the areas of the Tibetan Plateau, Siberia, Mongolia, China, possibly even as far out as Taiwan, that they achieved incredible stuff by the time of their disappearance 30 to 40,000 years ago. I mean, just look up the Denisovan bracelet, as it's called. It's this beautiful green bangle, which has a hole that's drilled through it that has been examined by scientists, and that the feed rate for this drill hole is so fast that it's comparable to a modern day drill. Now, I mean, that alone should raise the eyebrow and say, who the hell were these people? But on top of that, they create the first bone needles for tailored clothing. There's evidence that they may have domesticated and ridden horses. There's evidence also that they created the earliest musical instruments. And I think that there's a possibility from the legends that exist in the very areas that they were, which talk about these, giant individuals. And what we know about the Denisovans so far is that they were huge, that they were comparable in size to the largest WWE wrestlers or the largest American footballers, is that they are possibly the memory of the giants, they're behind these legends of the giants. And of course, that brings awesome. In the stories of the Watchers and the Nephilim. I mean, you have to look at the Watchers and Nephilim through the lens of Hebrew myth and legend. There was not a universal idea about Watchers and Nephilim. This has purely come to us through Hebrew sources, whether it be the Book of Enoch, the Book of Giants, the Book of Jubilees, and other similar texts that talk about the antics, the lifestyle, the society of these Watchers and their offspring, the Nephilim. But what is this a memory of? And I think it's a memory of those that carried the legacy of the Denisovans from Siberia, Mongolia, all the way down into southwestern Asia, what is today Anatolia, and the evidence that these large figures, these really oversized humans were about, is now coming to light at Karahan Tepe, for instance. I mean, just last year, they discovered this new enclosure, a huge new enclosure, on the very top of the hill. And in it, they found this giant human statue that's actually in a seated position. So it sort of goes down like that. Now, even with it being seated, it's 7.5 feet tall. It's got a huge head, similar sort of size-wise to the head that's in the pillar shrine. But this is much more anatomically correct. Even in the ears, there's little holes where they would have hung earrings, for instance. So something I only noticed earlier on this year. And who is this person? What does it represent? Now, it's easy to say, it's a divine ancestor, part of some kind of clan or tribal line. But why make them so big? Why? I mean, if this guy stood up, if he was able to, he'd probably be as much as 9 feet tall. Why create statues so tall? And I think that it's a memory of very tall people that were behind the foundation of these structures. And I think, therefore, we are looking towards the founders, the builders, the prime movers of the Tash Tepe culture, because that's what the scientists, archaeologists want to call this civilization.
The Tash Tepe,
which means stone hills or stony hills.
I like this idea. I like this idea because now you're making me think of the Gobekli Tepe enclosures. You can look at it as these two really tall central figures with tool belts and things, and they're standing there and they're sort of surrounded by smaller figures facing inwards, like they're being taught, like it's a school.
Yeah,
that's exactly correct.
Yeah, that's cool.
There you go. And I mean, the pillars that you're talking about that are in the center of, let's say, enclosure D, I mean, they're 18 feet tall.
Yeah.
5.5 meters tall. I mean, that's enormous. And yet, when you look at them, one of them, the head is horizontal, perfectly horizontal. But the other one, the head is tilted down towards you.
Yeah.
As if it is looking down at you.
Right.
As if it's looking at you from this great height. And that's something that you find in churches with certain statues of Christ or the Virgin Mary or whatever. If they're meant to be placed high, then their heads will be tilted so that they're looking down at you. And this is a very, very similar principle. The idea that when you go into these enclosures and approach between these pillars, you're doing so because you are honouring the presence of these great ones. Now, whether they are ancestors or celestial beings or whatever, it depends on interpretation, really. But that's what's going on here. I'm sure of it.
Yeah. The other thing I was thinking about with Eden, in the Bible, after they're banished from Eden, it says that, an angel is placed at the entrance with a flaming sword to guard the entrance. And I'm thinking, of course, of the Younger Dryas and this impact. And the idea of a flaming sword is basically what stands between
one age and the next.
Yes, one age and the next. Humans are blocked through time from going back into Eden because it was destroyed with a flaming sword. These impacts coming from the sky.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably correct. Actually,
yeah, it's interesting
I mean, if you look in, let's say, Chinese tradition, there's a whole illustration that's done of different comets in the sky. I mean, you'll find it online, and at least one of them is as a sword, basically. So the idea of the sword being a comet, and I think maybe we need to talk about comets for a moment, because the smart money is on the beginning of the Younger Dryas being triggered by a comet impact, or more specifically, the fragmentation of a fragment of comet that probably passed around the sun on its so-called perihelion, its closest approach. And as it came out of that orbit, it was basically, sent towards the Earth, and it then begins to break up, until you've got hundreds, if not thousands, of small parts of this comet fragment that very quickly enter the atmosphere and explode in what's known as air blasts. And these totally devastate the Northern Hemisphere, from probably Siberia through to Alaska, across obviously the ice caps that were in America, creating other craters, so-called Carolina Bays, from New York State all the way down to Florida. These are these oval aligned craters that were only noticed from the air once we started flying over them, I think in the 1920s. But also it was in Europe, and it reached as far as the area of Gobekli Tepe. I mean, there's evidence of activity dating from about 10,800 BC on a site called Abu Huraira, which is on the Euphrates, which is about 150 miles away from Gobekli Tepe, which clearly suggests a comet impact. Or sorry, not so much a comet impact, but an air blast that's created so much heat that it's melted the sand and the small stones and soil, whatever it is, directly beneath it. And that's there. That's on the Euphrates. I mean, unfortunately, we can't go to it today because one of the dams on the Euphrates has caused that particular site to be drowned, unfortunately. But we certainly have many samples from it that show that that there was some kind of air blast that took place there. And of course, this is a common thing all around the world. And what I suggested in my book, Gobekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods, that came out in 2014, was that there was comet imagery on the stones at Gobekli Tepe, in particular Pillar 18, which is the big one that we've already talked about on the right-hand side as you go into Enclosure D. And there you've got a belt buckle. The guy's wearing a belt with various glyphs on it. He's got a belt buckle, and he's got like this 3-pronged disc. And immediately I saw that, I thought, that's a comet. That's a 3-pronged or 3-tailed comet. And in a particular position as well, obviously very close to the horizon with the sun beneath it. Either the sun's just set or the sun's about to rise, and it's there with the 3 prongs sticking up. And then directly beneath that belt, the figure's wearing a fox pelt loincloth. So it's the one next to it. But what's so important about that is that the fox is a symbol of a trickster, like the coyote in Native American tradition. It's a trickster. It can do good or it can do bad. You don't know. You don't know what it's going to do. But the fox, and particularly its tail, is a universal symbol of catastrophes, basically, and comets in particular. And I mean, I mean, even in heraldry, for instance, in European heraldry, a comet is shown as a fox's tail, for instance. I mean, clearly from some weird ancient tradition which has now been lost. So I think what's going on here is that these enclosures were originally built to pacify the people who were still in a state of fear every time a comet came into the sky. They'd fear that something bad was about to happen again. And I think that these prime movers, these elite, who I see in terms of shamans, possibly bird shamans, vulture shamans, obviously snake shamans as well, come into the midst of these people who are probably the indigenous peoples of the region. And they say to them, look, don't worry, in the future, there's going to be no further catastrophes, right? We'll make sure of that. We can see the signs in the sky. But for this to take place, you have to help us build these enclosures. They have to be made in a certain way. They have to be orientated in a certain way. They have to have these T-shaped pillars. You can all get together and start making them. And we're going to build them here. We're going to build them there. We're going to build them there. And so far we know of at least a dozen of these T-pillar sites that were built between 9,600 and about 8,000 BC. And they kept to the same style all the way through that entire period. I mean, that's the length that we've been building churches in the style that we build them today, with altars, in the east, in the direction of heaven, and obviously the iconography and the way that they're laid out and the rest of it. Why do we keep doing that? Why do we feel this need to create a church to look like a church? And of course, the answer is fear that if we don't do it, something bad will happen. And I think that this is the same as places like Karahan Tepe and Gobekli Tepe, where you haven't just got the main enclosures, you have dozens of other smaller enclosures, some of them no bigger than the size of a jacuzzi, basically, because I say that because they've all got benches inside them and look like, Flintstones jacuzzis or something, with like tiny little T-pillars at the end of them, just a sort of like representation of the same idea. Is that, why do you have to keep doing this? And also, why wasn't it found in a much wider area? We only find these in southeastern Turkey so far. Yes, there were contemporary cultures in northern Syria, in Iraq, probably in Iran, and certainly in central Turkey that have some of the components, but not the T-pillars. That's only in the area of the Şanlıurfa region. Şanlıurfa is the city there, and that was anciently known as Edessa. It was also the place of Abraham, where he begins his journey to the promised land. He's totally connected with that city. Even to this day, there's shrines to him there. The place where he was supposed to be born, the place where he was supposed to have been nearly killed by the wicked king Nimrod is there. But more importantly, and we would already start to talk about Eden here, is that the residents of Şanlıurfa have, for hundreds, and I'm going to assume thousands of years, believed that this was the location of the Garden of Eden. And even the most ancient name of Şanlıurfa talks about this, which is Adama, which means the place of Adam.
Yeah.
Adam as a word itself just means red earth, ultimately. And the story goes that God created the soul of Adam in heaven, and he puts him down on the ground at Şanlıurfa, makes his body with the red earth, the beautiful red earth in that area. And then obviously, from a rib or something, they create Eve. And of course, they live happily in the terrestrial garden until along comes the serpent. And the serpent says, why don't you eat of that tree over there, the tree of knowledge of good and evil? And so they say, all right, well, we'll do. They pluck this fruit, which, by the way, the whole idea of it being this nice rosy red apple or a pomegranate or something is a fiction. The word that's used in Hebrew for the word fruit also means seed and can mean the seed of wheat. And in various traditions, particularly in Islamic mysticism, the fruit of the Garden of Eden is actually a stalk of wheat. Okay? And this plays into the story from Shamlerfa, and I'll tell you for why. Because the story is that once they realised that they were naked and lost their innocence, God throws out Adam and Eve from the gardens, lest they eat of the other tree in the garden, which is the tree of life, and learn how to live forever. So they're thrown out. As you said, the entrance back into it is stopped by this angel with a whirling sword, which I think is a confusion of the catastrophe which probably took place earlier than Gobekli Tepe, but we'll come on to that. And they go onto the Haran plain, according to the legend, and they have to till the land. And so basically, according to the story, Adam turns around to Eve and says, what are we going to grow? And she said, oh, what about this that I've got in my hand that I just happen to have brought out of heaven? And it's a stalk of wheat. So they grow wheat. But it said that for the first several years, the yield is very small. And they're about to give up when a bull comes into their midst, and they think, oh, we can use this bull to plough the land. And the yield increases and they all live happily after. And it said that every year, to give thanks to the bull, they kiss the head of the bull. This is the story that's still told to this day in Shamlerfa. Now, what does that mean? Well, I can unpack that, because even to this day, amongst the indigenous peoples of the region, the bull is the earth itself. The horns of the bull holds up the heaven. And when that bull moves and shakes, you get earthquakes, you get volcanoes, you get thunderstorms. That's what people believe to this day. I mean, the guide on our tours, that, there's a Kurdish man, he told us this story. I mean, just as a matter of fact thing, this is what people believe. And, I thought, oh my God, what an incredible concept. But, obviously I followed it through. I found out that this wasn't simply something that was believed by him and his local community. This was much more widespread. And that this is clearly a very ancient idea. So the idea of Adam and Eve kissing the head of the bull is essentially them paying their respects to the earth itself, for yielding them this. But, I mean, that's just a story. However, what's so important is that we know that agriculture begins for the first time in the very area of the Haran Plain. I mean, something like 50 to 60 different varieties of wheat that we use today for everything from beer to bread to pasta to cakes, etc. Its DNA can be traced back to a wild form of wheat that grows to this day within sight of Gobekli Tepe. I mean, that's an extraordinary discovery, I think.
And do you think
just shows you that these legends, which clearly are wrapped around the biblical Genesis story, obviously. Now, which came first, chicken or an egg, we don't know. But it clearly shows that legends can retain within them information, kernels of information, probably across, in this case, 10 to 10,500 years ago, when agriculture first starts appearing in this area. But then you have to start saying to yourself, well, okay, well, that's great. What about the serpent then? What's a serpent? And I think that this serpent, the Serpent of Eden, is a abstract memory of the communications that were taking place at sites like Karahan Tepe, communicating with this cosmic serpent, and gaining information. They would go into an altered states of consciousness, probably using hallucinogens. They would allow the snake to possess them. And there are societies to this day that have rituals where God in the form of a snake will possess people, and they will hit the ground and writhe around like snakes, believing that the god has actually possessed them. I mean, it's there, for instance, in Thailand. I describe this in the book. It's there, obviously, within voodoo practices of Haiti. And it's almost certainly there, in other very fundamental Christian traditions, snake veneration and speaking in tongues and whatever. So this is something which I think was going on in the past. And if you want a comparison, just look towards, let's say, the Oracle of Delphi, the mythical Oracle of Delphi. Now, according to the stories, a priestess known as a Pythia or an oracle would sit on a tripod-shaped chair seat, and this would be directly over fumes that would raise up and intoxicate her, and these would come from the rotting corpse of a serpent that had been killed by Apollo. And when this Pythia is in an intoxicated state, it said that Apollo himself would enter inside her, possess her, and speak through her mouth. But what's so interesting is that this is not Apollo as like some god of light, but a serpent, a snake. And you can clearly see this not just in the ancient images of from the Pythia, the oracle, but also sorry, he's trying to ring me again. That's the other phone now. Right. But it was a mate of mine. I told him that I was doing an interview, but he clearly forgot, basically. He said, well, where is he? Why isn't he ringing me? Right, sorry. So, yes, possession. Yeah, I think that basically what was happening with the Oracle of Delphi is that this was a much more civilized form of what was happening at Karahan Tepe many thousands of years earlier. And it was oracular. It was about oracular communication, gaining knowledge from a cosmic supernatural source seen in terms of a snake, and that this information then would be conveyed to waiting attendants who would then share it with the rest of that society. That, I think, is the real story behind what was going on in the Garden of Eden, which we can associate with this very area.
So how do you take the standard model analysis of these mounds? I mean, to me, the Gobekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe are just massive midden mounds. Like you said, when you're walking up, you're seeing all the debitage, all the flakes and flint tools and all this stuff. These people, the pre-pottery Neolithic, were well established for decades before discovering these sites. And I mean, Jericho, many other sites all over where there's plenty of this same exact material. They were doing all the same stuff. They even possibly, had invented or started farming like roughly 1,000 years before Gobekli Tepe. And so, well, that's what some of the archaeologists say. Not at Gobekli Tepe,
but that's wild wheat, though. That's different to domesticated wheat. And we've been experimenting with wild wheat going back to 30,000 years ago. It's there, for instance, in Russia, amongst the Gravatian peoples. There, the evidence has been found. It was also extensively used in Egypt around 13,000 BC, at some sites in the area of Aswan that were clearly very, advanced peoples. And it was being used in the Levant, the countries that we now associate with Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan. It was going back at 11,000 BC, before the time of the Younger Dryas. But the actual domestication And the widespread use of it does not occur until we hit around 8,500. And that almost certainly is what's going on in the area of Gobekli Tepe. And the Haran Plain is the central area of all the Taj Tepe sites. They are all situated around it, whether to the west, the east, the north.
That's fair enough.
Not the south. The south is we get into northern Syria. And although you've got what we call pre-pottery Neolithic sites there, they change in style. Yeah, they're not the same. So, it's mostly around the Haran Plain. And obviously with the city of Shanlerfa being the main sort of, central focus of it, certainly today, that I think that, that was the core of it, really. I mean, even Shanlerfa, I mean, we know that there was a massive Taj Tepe presence there because they've excavated the sites of them and Urfa Man. This huge, was it 6.5 feet tall, pole-like human individual with these dark obsidian eyes, no mouth, no nose. I mean, that was found just to the north of what's known as the Pools of Abraham at Shanlerfa, and that was clearly part of one of these Taj Tepe sites.
That's really what I'm wanting to get at. What I wanted to ask you about is not so much the farming aspect, but that the standard model wants to associate this midden mound of really roughly hewn flint tools with these beautifully carved megalithic constructions and statues and things like ornaments and things like that. Now, I just personally have looked at a lot of different lithic types, and the lithics at these sites are some of the most rudimentary lithics I've ever seen. We've got 12,000 years of lithics in the United States they're just beautiful compared to these things that we find at Gobekli Tepe. Now, I love those too, but they're not sophisticated. And so I kind of think that like this midden around these stone circles was like the pre-pottery Neolithic people finding these stone circles and venerating them and staying there, and the midden building up around them. This is how they get buried in the midden. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, look, we got there's plenty of dating evidence from these. We got obviously radiocarbon dates coming out from different positions at all of these sites.
Yeah,
but you've also got contextual dating, and that obviously is something that's built up over many decades and really goes back to the work of the British Egyptologist Flinders Petrie at the end of the 19th century of stratification and contextual evidence. And the stone tools that are found in the vicinity of both Gobekli and Karahan very clearly talk in terms of what they call the pre-pottery Neolithic, dating from about 9,600 down to about 8,000 BC, possibly slightly later. But as far as the actual state of the type of tools, it varies. I mean, firstly, what I've seen is that there are much older stone tools, particularly at Karahan Tepe, which has been acknowledged, that go back to the Lower Paleolithic period. So they're probably a minimum of around 250,000 years of age. But they could have been what they call heirlooms. In other words, they were picked up and kept for whatever reason, either for practical purposes or to present as some kind of gift to the gods. So that doesn't necessarily mean that there was activity at that time going on at these sites. But what I can say is that some of the stone tools that have been found, particularly at Gobekli, because they've already reached the Shanlerfa Museum, so you can actually see them, are incredibly sophisticated, and they use a process which you will be familiar with, from Clovis points and whatever, which is pressure flaking.
Yeah.
Now, pressure flaking means that you can create stone tools that look like Swarovski jewels, beautiful artifacts, and this is a particular style that originates far in the east, as far east as Mongolia and Siberia, around 30,000 years ago. And what happens is that it slowly comes into Europe, mostly into Russia, but also into Eastern Europe, but also comes down into southwestern Asia and eventually enters Anatolia, probably about 10 to 11,000 BC.
Is this Solutrean?
I mean, if you go, you can see these stone tools. I mean, most of them are made of flint, but some of them are made out of obsidian, which is a much more brittle.
It's easier to work than
substance.
flint.
Yeah, but it's easier, but it's also easier to break it.
Yeah.
But because it's like shards, it's the sharpest thing in the world. Almost.
Yeah, I've worked it.
I mean,
I've worked both flint and obsidian.
You see these incredibly sophisticated tools. As I said, you can see them. They're on display at Llanlerfa Museum.
Okay, cool.
But alongside, you quite rightly point out, there's much cruder ones, and I think that is part of the hunter-gathering society who have been brought in to construct these monuments.
That's kind of what I think that's really where I'm leaning, is that it's two different. There's at least two different levels of sophistication there. There's a very rudimentary, simple level of building type, which could possibly be the simple lithics, but also those unhewn cobblestone walls. Right, that looks like a restoration effort in a lot of cases.
But you got to be careful here. I mean, we can go to somewhere like Peru, and see examples of like huge, puffy, polygonal megalithic blocks, and we can see the smaller ones on top of that, and then we can see the rough hewn walls above that, which can clearly be associated, let's say, with the Inca, and that tells us that the lower levels are from a pre-Incan civilization. That's so obvious that even a child can essentially point that out. But I think it's much more difficult when you go to places in the ancient world, because it's so easy to say, that looks sophisticated, therefore the walls around it must be much more recent. And the dating evidence that we've got does not basically suggest that at this time.
No, I think the walls are old.
As far as
the walls are as old, the walls are some of the oldest dating too. Yeah,
but I mean, I mean, the best that we can say is that some of the carved stones clearly are already in secondary use. By the time you come to about 9,000 BC, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they were carved thousands of years earlier.
Right.
I mean, to me, Tash Tepe starts around 10,000 BC in the area of Llanlerfa. There are probably various different cultures involved. You got probably people coming up from the south, probably as far south as Egypt. I mean, there are sites in Egypt, particularly a place called Helwan, which is today a big city just to the south of Cairo, where you had settlements going back to 19,000 BC, which were very sophisticated, and they exist concurrently with Gobekli Tepe and Karahan. And the stone tools found there match those found in the area of Llanlerfa at the same time, particularly something called the Helwan Point, which I've done a lot of work on, and so did Klaus Schmidt, the actual discoverer of Gobekli Tepe. He realised that there was a relationship between the area of Gobekli Tepe and Helwan in Egypt, probably before anybody else. I mean, I got onto it, wrote about it in great detail in my book, The Cygnus Key. But anyway, so you've got that. Plus, you've probably also got peoples coming down from the mountains, the Zagros Mountains. They were called the Zazian peoples. They're the ones that probably bring in the traditions to do with the vultures and, the idea of excarnation and sky burials and stuff like that, because almost certainly that's what they were already doing. But then you've got other peoples probably coming in from the west, probably from the Aegean area, Western Turkey, highly sophisticated people that were using seafaring vessels to get across to Cyprus by this time. I mean, the earliest mass settlements of Cyprus go back at least to 11,000 BC. Now, this wasn't just a few people turning up occasionally. This was the establishment of a massive society. Hundreds of people must have been going back and forth from the mainland to Cyprus to sustain this society over such a long period of time. So they had seafaring vessels. So that was more people coming in that would have had this knowledge. They were probably coming into southeastern Anatolia. Plus, you've got these other elite that I'm talking about that almost certainly start their journey in Siberia and Mongolia. And even though you might say, well, 30,000 years ago is an awful long time ago, it's like waves. It's like waves of a tide gradually getting closer and closer into Anatolia. Plus, we know that contact now between Siberia, Mongolia, and Anatolia was continuing on right the way through until the beginning of the Younger Dryas period. This is brand new information that I was able to obtain, and this is going to be a big, big thing that the archaeologists are working on a site. I can't say exactly where, but it's just on the edge of the Tash Tepe region where they found evidence of activity that can only have come from Siberia. Awesome. And it suggests that people are migrating back and forwards from Siberia to Anatolia as early as 11,000 BC, 30,000 years ago. So this would have been just before the time of the Younger Dryas event. So, so so we got these people coming in, and I think they're the ones that end up being the shamanic elite, the prime movers. And they then bring everybody together with all their different skills, the carvers and the rock carvers and, the agriculturalists, the people that are good for each different part of their society. And that's how Tash Tepe is created.
I find it strange that it's like, once again, I know that's obviously we have an incomplete record in archaeology, so maybe we'll find something in the future, but it seems like it's a fully formed iconography and style that just boom, and it's everywhere, all in the Tash Tepe. And it's like, what? Where did this come from? That's kind of the thing that gets me about it. Is there a sort of development phase?
Yeah.
Like, do we see development of this iconography?
Clearly something new was going on.
Yeah.
For Tash Tepe, but this is the combination of various different, let's call them hunter-gathering societies coming together to create these. But clearly you've got thousands of years of expertise coming with this as well. And I think this is coming from various different directions. As I said, definitely coming up from the Levant. It's probably coming in from Western Turkey. And it's coming down via either the Caucasus or across the Zagros Mountains from Iran to the east, or from Russia and the steppe in the north, which, remember, is like your superhighway, that takes you from Europe all the way into China. And you would probably even had links with Vedic tradition or pre-Vedic tradition, peoples who would have been trading, possibly exotic materials, certain types of minerals and stones, in particular, would have been using that Silk Road, which basically comes within just 15, 20 miles of the area of Karahan itself. We're talking about cosmopolitan cultures here. The other important thing is that before Tash Tepe, there were a series of much earlier settlements that seem to be like the proto-form of Tash Tepe on the Tigris River. Now, it's much closer, the big inland sea known as Lake Van. And there were several of these, and like Bonchukli Tala, and various other names have gone out my head at the moment. But anyway, we visited some of them. And, these are clearly the precursors of Tash Tepe. And these people have definitely got links with the Caucasus. And they're definitely, one of their big trades is in obsidian. Obsidian seems to be the peacemaker, if you like. It's like if you're some kind of salesman back in the day, and say, look, I've got these beautiful obsidian pieces here, which we can have a big deal, but let's sit down and have a meal first and talk about things, and we'll come to some kind of agreement later on.
Yeah.
I mean, this type of hunter-gatherer exchange society is something which almost certainly was bringing in these new people into the area, and the exchange of exotic materials, exotic goods would have been part of that process.
I definitely like this idea that it's more of a, like, something happens in terms of trade or transportation or something, and all of these cultures start to interact with each other. And so then you would have the spreading of knowledge and ideas. And then if there's peace and everything, then you could literally have, like, the coming together, like you're suggesting, of artisans and everybody to do something that's never been done before.
Yeah. But still
they've got a common goal as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. But still we go back to
making,
we go back to, like, and you did say, like, we have to remember that this comes from, the Hebrew legends, but the Watchers.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're saying Annunaki, that's how you say it? And then Denisovans?
Well, yeah, I mean...
So if they were giants coming from Siberia?
Yeah. Yes.
And the Watchers were supposed to teach, like, metallurgy,
and
agriculture and irrigation and, like, all this stuff we were talking about. But that implies that they had an advanced civilization already. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, the whole list of firsts which the Watchers were said to have given to their mortal wives is really the rudiments of civilization.
Yes,
really,
exactly.
It's the same with the Annunaki, or the Annuna, as they really should be called. This is a memory of these prime movers coming into this region. And I mean, quite clearly, they probably look different. I mean, yes, that they've probably got some height above the indigenous peoples. Let's assume that. But they probably looked different. They're coming in from somewhere which we would now associate with Northern Asia, possibly even Eastern Asia. They would have looked different, and the way that they would have been described. I mean, the Watchers are described as having viper visages like vipers is one of the term. In other words, they look like snakes. Now, what does that mean? And I tackle this particular question in my book, From the Ashes of Angels. And, we all know about the Viper Room. I think it's in Los Angeles, yeah? I mean, the reason why it was called the Viper Room is because, obviously, you'd have these jazz musicians on stage, and there would be a lot of interesting smoking going on. And basically, people would be starting to go into an audience, and they'd be looking at these musicians, blowing, and their faces would start to appear as if they looked like a snake. And that's how it actually got its name. I couldn't believe it when I heard this on the radio to start with, because at that very time I was trying to understand what the concept of a visage like a viper actually meant. Now, clearly we're not talking about jazz musicians here.
I've had the same thought.
Southeastern Turkey.
I'm telling you, I've had the exact same thought, that, like, watching a guy blow the trumpet or whatever, it's like they kind of look reptilian a little bit. Your face, whatever happens to your face.
Yeah. So in other words, it's the appearance of their face that's being talked about as looking like a viper. Now, not saying that they weren't, snake charmers as well. They probably were.
Yeah.
But they had something about them that made them look like a snake as well. And that could be the fact that they had Asian origins.
Yeah.
And would have had a much longer face, obviously, a different anatomical features that would have made them look different to the local people. And I think that this is part of that memory that's been recorded within the Watchers, the Nephilim, the Annunaki, and whatever. And the whole idea of the eyes, like, shining like the sun, or other pale features, pale skin. I mean, this is clearly people that have spent a lot of time in a very cold environment, which of course is what you're going to get the further north you go. And remember, this is at the very end of the Younger Dryas period, which was incredibly cold time. I mean, right, maybe in the summers it warmed up a bit, but the winters would have been the harshest that you could possibly imagine. And people had to live through this. Now, it wouldn't have affected Anatolia in quite the same way. I mean, yes, of course, it would have been incredibly cold. And of course, what I suggest, and some of my colleagues have followed suit, is that the underground cities in Turkey, at places like Derinkiyu in Cappadocia, that they were originally created during the time of the Younger Dryas so that people could actually shelter in them away from the elements, but they could also go out into the elements whenever they want. Because obviously the enemy, if you like, was the elements themselves, the weather, not people sieging them or whatever else the mad ideas are relating to the original use of these underground cities. But, and so I think that's it. I mean, all of this is happening during or just after the Younger Dryas period, when people are still in a state of fear. Now, there's a visionary writer by the name of Barbara Han Clough. She did a book called Catastrophobia. And the term catastrophobia she uses to describe the state of mind of people in the aftermath of this cataclysm. That, by the way, didn't just happen on one day. I mean, the evidence is that for at least 300 years after the initial impact, there were still other impacts going on. There were volcanoes, there were fires, there were all sorts of terrible things were going on in the world for hundreds of years afterwards. And even when that starts settling down, you've got this ice age now that's come back after a couple of thousand years where the other ice age had gone. Suddenly, it's all plunged back into ice and cold and re-advances of ice sheets and things like this. It would have been a terrible time to live. And quite clearly, there would have been a lot of movement of people trying to get away from this. This is the reason why I suggest that people end up coming into Anatolia, because this is somewhere that's just outside of most of the harshness of weather, which would have been, let's say, above the Black Sea on the steppe, and obviously, any higher climes in Europe and whatever. This would have been a really bad place to live at that time. So the further south you could get, the better the climate, the more chance of survival. Basically.
It's making me think too that, like, if there was contact on like the Silk Road or whatever, on the steppe between all these places, and then it started getting cold and everybody moves down there. Now they're blocked off from these places and they're forced to sort of live in this area together. Could be another reason why they exchanged all this knowledge. And
exactly.
Anyway, just that's cool.
Another thing. I mean, look, we can't say that people were not moving around, during the time of the Young Dryas. Almost they were. But for the most part, they were trying to get away from it.
Yeah.
And this would have meant that they would have migrated south. And that meant coming down through the Caucasus region, around the mountains or through passes, down into Anatolia. And I think this is what was going on. And this is where these earliest settlements start to be founded on the Tigris. Halem Shemi is another one. As I say, Bonchukli Tala, various other names I can't remember at the moment, and they're like proto forms. They've got elements of Tash Tepela. They've got porthole stones. They've got paved slab floors. They've obviously got the stone walls made of dry stone. Some of them use what they call orthostats. In other words, vertical stones, but they're not T-shaped. What else have you got? All the beads. Bonchuklu Tala, which is near the city of Mardin, where we're in the museum. You can see most of all this stuff. Thousands and thousands of beads, beautiful beads, have been found. I mean, the term means something like field of the beads, basically, because people were finding them there. So, of course, then the archaeologists look, they find this pre-pottery Neolithic or very late Paleolithic site, what's known as an epi-Paleolithic site there, and they recognise the similarity with places like Gobekli Tepe, but it's a more proto form of it. And these beads are now turning up at sites in Tash Tepela, particularly a place called Sefer Tepe, which is near the city of Viransia, which is probably about 20 miles to the northeast of Karahan Tepe. A lot of work's being done there right now by the archaeologists, including the discovery of dozens and dozens of human skulls that they've found that seem to have been removed from bodies and preserved.
And they're carving on them.
Kind of skull cult. A skull cult.
Yeah, aren't they? Some of them are like carved. They carved into the skulls too. Some artwork on them.
Not sure of that.
I was reading about that.
But I mean, this is very similar to a place called Chionu, which is another pre-pottery and Neolithic site, very advanced, goes back to about 9000 BC, outside the range of Tashtepela, but again, a lot of similarities. You have flagstone floors, you have terrazzo floors, terrazzo being a type of lime mortar, which is almost like the earliest form of geopolymer, if you like. You got that, and you got some very strange elements. There's one particular structure, rectilinear structure there, called the Skull Building. And the reason why it's called the Skull Building is because they found hundreds of human skulls beneath its flagstone floor. And they also found this huge slab in front of it, stone slab, that showed traces of human blood and bull's blood. Now, obviously, the first thought anybody has is, oh my God, human sacrifice.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, that's exactly what I thought. I think I talked about this in one of my books. But I now realise that probably is not quite what was going on, because when a person died, their body would have its head removed very quickly, and the rest of the body would then be taken away, clearly headless, placed out on a high spot, and the vultures would come down and pick it clean. They would take away the smallest of the bones, but the larger of the bones would be left behind. And I mean, if you want to see pictures of this sort of stuff, just type in Tibet sky burials, okay, in your browser, and some very gruesome pictures will come up, because it's still being practiced to this day on the Tibetan plateau. But anyway, it was going on at Tashtepela sites 9000 BC. But the head would be removed and used separately. It would be cleaned up. It would possibly be decorated, plaster put around it, maybe cowrie shells for eyes, could be painted. And this would be used for communication and a connection with the ancestors. Most obviously, the person whose skull it was, obviously. Now, this could be used for, wanting advice, maybe a problem in the family, get old Aunt Nellie's, skull out, and let's have a word with her and see what
how did you make that bread?
Yeah. What shape pillar should I carve?
Because these people believe that they could call the dead back. We still believe that today. We still got Feasts of the Dead, at the beginning of November, where people believe that they can still communicate with their those members of the family that have passed over.
Yeah,
obviously. But this was still going on. But there could be a more sinister reason for collecting skulls, because the skulls were seen as the seat of the soul. You see this as a symbol on various of the stones at Gobekli Tepe, either as an abstract bull or even a more obvious human head skull-like shape that's appeared. Often it's associated with vultures when it's shown. So if the skull was the seat of the soul, then it could be believed that by collecting the skulls, you were collecting the souls of all of these individuals. Very similar practices still go on to this day in Haiti, for instance, within voodoo tradition, that you can collect people's souls, although not as the actual skull itself these days, but you can collect them in bottles, canary jars, which the souls can be kept. And the more of those that you can keep, then the more you can harvest of those, the stronger the power of the shaman would become. So there could be a more macabre reason for storing skulls. And as I said, this is not only at Chionu, but also now at Serpent Tepe. And it's the more we're finding out about Serpent Tepe, which has T-shaped pillars, so it is a Tashtepela site, is that it clearly has links with these other more eastern sites like Chionu, Bonchuklitala, and other ones, that are seen to be like proto forms of the Tash Tepe movement.
So this building with all the skulls beneath the flagstones is like some kind of like magician's laboratory, like a place where he can do very powerful magic. Man.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, obviously, again, it's all speculation.
Yeah, of course. That is an interesting idea.
But yeah, I mean, but either one of those, is the likelihood. So, in other words, the reason why you've got human blood on that slab is probably because of the removal of the head post-mortem.
But they were also doing it to bulls too, so there was some kind of sacrifice there, maybe.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, and obviously, bull sacrifice. is something that still goes on in certain parts of the world to this day. So, no problem there. I mean, certainly as far as the authenticity of bull sacrifices, but whether there was actually human sacrifices is a difficult thing to say, and it's a very touchy subject as well. I mean, archaeologists tend to shy away from anything. I mean, I couldn't believe when I first started finding out about this to do with Chayonu, and there is slight amount of evidence of it at Navali Chori, which is another Tash Tepe site, one that's been lost beneath the waters of the Ataturk Dam in the northern part of Şanlıurfa. There's slight evidence of similar activity there. And I began to think, oh my God, these people are very similar to, those that were committing human sacrifices in Central and South America. But I'm shying away from that idea a bit now. I think that it's a bit naive to look at it that way. So I think something much more interesting is going on relating to the presence of these skulls and the presence of human blood at Chayonu. Okay.
So I do want to go back to, again, let's go back to the Watchers and all this stuff. You mentioned briefly at the beginning of the interview that they could basically be called the people of the sky. So
the Annunaki, yeah.
Yes, the Annuna, as you said, right? The people of the sky.
So
So if the Denisovans or Denisovans, however you say it, were maybe these people are associated with the Watchers, why would they be called the people of the sky? I'm just trying to...
Nice one.
What?
That's a very good question. It's a very good question. And I think that the answer is relatively simple. They're people not of the sky. In other words, they're astronomers. They don't come from the sky. They have knowledge of the sky. They have knowledge of astronomy, knowledge of astrology, knowledge of cosmology, ontology, and also they are able to accurately predict the return of comets. Halley's Comet, for instance, is on a cycle, an orbit of, I think, 76 years. Now, it wouldn't take you very many generations to work out that comet comes into the sky every 76 years. And look, how much could you impress somebody?
Yeah.
If these people say, well, how can you stop these cataclysms? Well, they say, watch.
Yeah.
Next year, you will see that the comet will appear in the sky because we know these things. And one just appears in the sky. Oh, my God. These people really know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
So, suddenly they become the masters. They become the ones saying, work with us and we will ensure that your catastrophobia goes away. And this catastrophobia, I think, is one of the motivations why they created Tash Tepe in the first place. I mean, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of legends around the world to do with catastrophes. And these catastrophes talk about floods, they talk about fire, they talk about things falling out the sky, periods of darkness, terrible, terrible things going on in the world. But what's so interesting about a number of these legends is that the survivors, the Noah and his family of whatever, different part of the world the story is told, one of the first things that they do once it's all over is build a altar to their God to give thanks.
Yeah.
Now that is very, very telling because, to me, what you're seeing is something similar going on with Tash Tepe. These people are connecting with this because they're responding to the fact that you've had these cataclysms they're now over, but they want to make sure that they don't happen again.
So that's cool. The Taj Tepe lair is like a civilizational altar to the cataclysm that had come before. That's free. That's really cool.
But it's not just a case of some kind of, memorial.
Yeah.
It's a case of easy access into the sky world.
Yeah.
You've got a pillar there, pillar 43, which is a virtual mnemonic teaching device to the shamans, showing all the steps of getting into the sky world via the Milky Way, via certain stars and constellations. You got a huge, great vulture there that right in the centre of it, representing a psychopomp, the soul carrier, that which accompanies the soul from the from the physical world into the afterlife. You've got the 3 so-called man bags on the top. Now, some of my colleagues want to see them as bags that you put your stash in. Not to me. Firstly, when you look at them, the handles are completely off centre anyway. So how many handbags have you seen where the handle's completely off centre? It doesn't make any sense. All your belongings would be going up and down. They're not handbags, in my opinion. You have like these rectangles, which I think represent land, if you like.
Yeah.
And the arches over the top represent the arch of heaven. They are the vault of the sky. And the reason I say that is because you have 3 of them. They represent, in my opinion, the 3 worlds: the sky world, the middle world, and the lower world. Each one has a little animal next to it that is a symbol of one of those 3 worlds. For the sky world, you have a wader bird like a flamingo. For the middle world, you have a leopard. And for the lower world, you have a toad or a frog, which is a universal symbol of underworld activity. But all 3 of those animals are very carefully chosen because they can all leap between worlds. They can all exist in the different mediums of those different worlds. And you have all around the man bags these chevrons, these lines of chevrons. Almost certainly that's water. And it's the water of the cosmic ocean. The cosmic ocean is a principle that's still important to Vedic religion and literature to this day. It's still there within the beliefs of various different indigenous peoples of the Middle East. It's there, obviously, in other parts of the world. And basically, and in Egypt, ancient Egypt, the ancient Egyptian religion talks a lot about it. And it's basically that there was this primeval water existing before everything. And the first land emerges out of that in some way. And that then gradually expands to become the landmass on which you live. Obviously, the very centre point where the land expands out from becomes what's known as an omphalos.
Yeah.
The centre of it all, basically. And so the cosmic ocean is out there. So these 3 worlds are floating, if you like, in the cosmic ocean. And I think that, that's basically what's being taught to the shamans or the initiates, the supplicants, whoever it is that have gone into this enclosure. Somebody's saying to them, look there, that's what you're going to encounter when you go into your altered state. If you go off, and you go out, these are the signs to look for on your path into the heavens.
What do you think about all the serpents all over the T-pillars? There's a whole bunch of them in various different positions, sort of like slithering side by side, or some coming up the chest. And have you thought about all those and what they might represent?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I talk all about that in the Cygnus Mystery. Yeah, another book we did. And this almost certainly is a representation of the effects of hallucinogens. I mean, if somebody's on an ayahuasca experience, one of the things that they see again and again, and this is recorded by ethnobotanists and whatever, scholars who have spent time with indigenous peoples and obviously taken ayahuasca themselves. is snakes. Lots of snakes. Snakes will be curling around trees, around doorways, whatever. And so the idea of representing that in association with the stones, I think, makes perfect sense. But what's also interesting to do with, let's say, the ayahuasca experience, and I've heard this from various individuals, is that often, yes, they see snakes, but they'll see a single important snake will come up to them. It will raise up towards them, and they will get this sense that the snake wants to enter inside them. And, and I mean, from what I hear, they hesitate because they don't know what this means or whether it be good or bad experience or whatever. So they generally don't go for it. But they then afterwards say, I wish I had, because I now sense that it was going to give me knowledge and wisdom. But it had to do it by becoming a part of me to do so.
By terrifying you first, yeah.
Because this brings us into the whole idea of raising the Kundalini in Vedic, yogic or tantric tradition, or evoking within you the good serpent of Gnostic tradition. All of these ideas was that the serpent either was in you and rises up inside you, or enters in, and it enters in the lower areas and then rises up through the body, and obviously in many cases will come out into the crown itself, like a naga snake in Vedic tradition. And of course that's one of the symbols of enlightenment. Obviously, Buddha or something sitting beneath the Bodhi tree or something like this. The idea of enlightenment, through the presence of this naga snake, that's almost become a part of you. And I think once again that something similar was taking place at Karahan Tepe, that they weren't just communicating with the cosmic serpent, they were inviting it inside their body. They were inviting its active spirit to enter inside them.
Yeah, the pharaohs had the uraeus, right? The serpent coming out of the forehead too on their headdresses. So
yeah,
as a symbol.
Gnostic tradition, I think, is really important here.
Yeah,
because a lot of what's known as the Orphite Gnostic sects begin in the area of northern Syria, southeastern Turkey, at places like Haran, Şanlıurfa, Rufasa, which is in northern Syria, and quite clearly, other places that would become associated with, like Aleppo and Damascus and places like this. All of these are associated with the foundations of Gnosticism, which went under the umbrella of Christianity, but really had very little to do with it, in all honesty.
So why do you think in a lot of the ancient depictions in those areas, for example, we just went through the British Museum, which we had never seen before, and I love the Assyrian panels. All of the panels from the throne room of Ashurbanipal III. So you have all of these deities and these these sages, these Apkallu shown with wings, and holding, so like, are these also associated, do you think, that the sages, the Apkallu, are they part of the Watchers, or is this something else?
Well, again, be careful not to mix things together here. I mean, they are Syrian. It's from Hebrew myth and legend that the idea of the Watchers and the Nephilim. So really, they should become compartmentalized into biblical / Hebrew tradition. When we come on to the Assyrians, obviously the Syrians were like the end product of various Mesopotamian cultures, like the Akkadians, the Sumerians, the Babylonians. So they were almost like the high point, if you like. They reached their full in the first few centuries of the first millennium BC. So what we see there is a sort of hybrid of everything that's been learnt over the past few thousand years. And you're right, you've got what they call winged genie. And these are these figures with these wings on their back, and they hold what people call a man bag, but they're not man bags
like
at all. They're actually buckets. And they would have contained a liquid, which would either have been maybe some kind of holy water or a herb water, or some might suggest like an oil, like a cedar oil or something like this. And in the other hand, they've got a pine cone, and they're using the pine cone to spray the tree of life which stands in front of them. And that tree of life represents all of the lineages going back to the gods themselves, and basically probably to the beginning of creation as well. That's a symbol of everything that they've achieved ultimately, and their point of connection. That's why it's called the tree of life, because it represents all life from the beginning up to and including now. But it also has to be nurtured and kept by these divine beings. Now, some people have called them Annunaki, have suggested that they are. I'd like to see the word Annunaki written right by one of them to actually say that is
Apkallu is what I've seen, is they're like the sages, right?
This thing you described that they're doing with the bucket and the pine cone.
Yeah, they're dipping it.
That's like in the Catholic Church, they have this. The priest does this thing. I can't remember what it is, but they go along with something and and nail you with
the holy water.
Is it the holy water that they're flicking on people?
Yeah,
it's like the same.
Yeah.
Wow,
it's the same thing. Yeah,
that's really cool.
So they're watering you with the water of life.
No question that those winged genie are fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, I also have spent far too much time looking at them, in the British Museum.
Yeah. Yep, we went there to look at Egyptian stuff, some vases and some other statues, and then the Easter Island head. But I spent almost all the time in that hallway with those panels.
Yeah, they're awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, one of the most interesting sections is the Sumerian section. Yeah, Sumerian Mesopotamian. I mean, there's so much interesting stuff in there.
Yeah,
even more so than the Egyptian, really. I mean, the Egyptian stuff's classic in the sense that that's what you would associate with the British Museum.
Yeah.
But I think much cooler stuff is in the Sumerian Mesopotamian section.
Yeah, absolutely. Their symbols are just, I don't know, I find them fascinating.
Yeah.
You can really get lost in it. And you're right. We have to be careful not to conflate things that aren't necessarily conflatable. But I think that, like you're saying that,
and I mean, things are cool. I mean, I think what's important is that we can all have theories and ideas and whatever, but it's important to keep your feet on the ground at the same time, really to keep it real. Yeah, that's what I try and do with my books. I mean, a lot of the theories that some of my colleagues come up with, I just can't see where they're coming from, in all honesty. I don't want to mention any names or anything, but you've got to keep your feet on the ground. If you're going to start writing about this subject or researching or doing videos on it, just try and keep a firm foundation in what you're saying. I mean, it's easy to suddenly start claiming that, that structures that the archaeologists say are 800 BC are actually now 50,000 years old, as some of my colleagues, as you probably know, are claiming. But there's no evidence for that whatsoever at all. But because it sounds sexy, it's going to be the one that gets the most hits.
Yeah.
There's no question about that. So, so in other words, there's a dichotomy here. If you keep it too real, you won't get the interest. But if you really go over the top and you get all the hits, you're also essentially selling your soul to these wild theories and not coming back from them, really. Because once you do, unless you suddenly realise you've made mistakes and admit it to your audience, say, look, I really made a mistake. I thought that these were X age. I've now, realised through further research, speaking to the right people, that, that they're actually much younger than this type, which they're not going to do. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
I mean, once people have a hypothesis and they put it out there, they rarely change their mind. I mean, it's like supporting a football group, sort of a football team. I mean, if you support, let's say, Manchester United and Manchester City start having all of the best players, you don't switch suddenly to Manchester City. You support Manchester United forever until you die, because that's what your family have supported, and you will do, and your children will, and their children will. It's the same thing, isn't it? It's like, It's like Atlantis. It's like if you say that Atlantis is Antarctica, you're going to die on that hill. You're going to say it's Antarctica. If you say Jack the Ripper was a certain candidate, just because new information coming out, you're not going to change your mind. And it's the same thing with the ancient mysteries. Some people have got theories within this, and they're going to die on that hill, whether they're right or wrong.
That's true.
Well, I mean, we've seen that.
Yeah.
We've had to throw out a whole lot of really great theories.
Yeah.
Because they turned out to not be so great. But I'm kind of hung up on the Gobekli Tepe standard model intentional burial. Like when I was there, I did a lot of research after I went there, but initially my impression was like, this is just occupation layers midden that's built up. And then, after I read all these scientific papers talking about the problems they had with the layering and the inverted layers, I think that I do not believe right now that these were intentionally buried. I think they were.
Okay. Yeah. Well, see, this is an interesting conundrum, because, I mean, originally Klaus Schmidt at Gobekli Tepe said that everything was deliberately buried, basically. But recently, the archaeologists at the site have gone the opposite way. They're now saying, oh, no, it was all just a case of they built these other structures around on top of the main ones, like enclosure C, D, B, and all the stuff just eventually just fell in. But there is problems there, massive problems with that, because you've still got the huge T-pillars in enclosure D still in place.
You're right.
And they were exactly in place when they were found. Yes, if you go next door to enclosure C,
they've toppled over.
The tops of the central pillars have been broken off. One they had to re-erect and glue back on, basically.
They think that one was intentional destruction.
It's very possible, but the piece that they've stuck back on was bent in a way with the rubble on it that clearly looked like it had been broken based upon the pressure of the weight. So I think it's a case of both.
Yeah, you had a flank failure and it hit it, broke it.
Yeah, intentionally buried, but then the debris then just fell in on top of that. At Karahan Tepe, Nejmi Carroll, the main archaeologist at work there, has written a whole paper showing how the rock cut enclosures were all intentionally buried.
I got it.
A case of just spading of some soil and rubble in, but in layers, specific layers. In fact, one of the layers, it was a type of red earth that is not local to the area. So they must have shipped it in from a minimum of 15 to 20 miles away. And that, I would say, probably came from the Haran Plain.
That could have been. I got a theory.
Big fertile area.
I got a theory for that red layer. They made some bricks, and the bricks melted and made a big layer of specific type of clay.
Maybe. Look, they were. I have
to admit, I have not read any published papers about Karahan Tepe.
But I do remember when we were there that they were saying that the archaeologists of Karahan is like, no, this place.
I know that. Yeah,
was deliberately buried. No matter what they're saying about Gobekli Tepe now, Karahan was deliberately buried.
Eventually, I'm gonna go through and read all that stuff. I'm not convinced yet, but I'm willing to be convinced. But I'm having trouble believing that they did this over and over on such a massive scale.
You've got to say to yourself, why would they do it?
Yeah,
and the answer is, why do we bury dead bodies? And the answer to that is reverence for the dead, reverence for the spirit, the memory of those people. And I think that they treated these enclosures like a living being, a living entity with its own, what they call genius loci in Greek terms, which means the spirit of the place. Now, we see that as a metaphor for, a presence maybe at a certain, no. In the past, they would have believed that every building that they built had its own spirit, just like every natural outcrop, every natural feature, every body of water, every mountain would have had its spirit. It's the concept we call today panpsychism, that everything has consciousness, to a more or a lesser degree. And I think that this is exactly the manner that these people would have responded to the closing down, the deactivation of a particular enclosure. They would have felt that they needed to do it with reverence. And that's exactly what they did with the pillar shrine. They built up these layers, gradually going up until the very top of the pillars, they actually put large stones on them and then built it up even further and put more stones on so that you knew exactly where those pillars were. Why would you do that if you did not want to memorialize that site? And obviously know exactly whereabouts it was, just in case in some future generation you wanted to open it again.
Mm. Yeah, we have wondered about this iconoclastic action that's supposed to.
There's a couple of enclosures that they just.
How did they know where it was? They dug straight down to it. Well, if there were markers, that's a good point. That's great.
They dug down into what's the one enclosure with the
big squared ones that are broken.
No, this is another one we didn't get to go into at Gobekli Tepe. It's not in the. There was a ramp in the midden going down. Enclosure H or something.
I think it's H.
H. Oh yeah.
Yeah, they left a ramp, like a circular ramp, to where they could get down in there, and so like I love the idea of ancient archaeology. Like apparently, a long time ago, these very ancient people were digging these things up and revealing the pillars and everything. And in some cases, they didn't destroy them, like in enclosure H.
Yeah.
But it is believed that in enclosure C, somebody dug directly to those two central pillars and shattered them and then buried it, which is, I don't know. I'm kind of...
I mean, certainly, as I said, parts of them broke off because of the pressure of the weight of the rubble and soil leaning down.
Yeah, maybe they dug it out and then left and then it collapsed in.
But having said that, is that if it was simply a case of, the pressure and weight, we'd have found the tops of those pillars there, and they've not been found. Yeah. So they were knocked off. I think that they were knocked off and they were removed to somewhere else, either for reuse as rubble or deliberately destroyed, maybe. I mean, I'm not saying that when they decommissioned these enclosures, they did it with total reverence. I mean, there is definitely evidence of some kind of destructive element to it, where they would remove certain stones that clearly represented something more than the others. Now, whether they removed them to put them in another enclosure, whether they removed them to destroy them, we don't know. But certainly they were doing different things with different stones. Some they were leaving in place, some they were removing probably to destroy them, some that they were removing them because they had such reverence for them. They probably represented, ancestors. And if that's the case, then destroying them would be a complete no. You just wouldn't do that. Certainly not if it was an important ancestor. I mean, the work that I'm doing at the moment is all about Stonehenge, and in particular the altar stones. There were two altar stones. There's one still in place, the other one has gone missing, and the search to try and find it is a big thing at the moment. But the altar stones, you have to say to yourself, why were these huge stones? I mean, the one that's there now was brought all the way from northeastern Scotland. That's over 500 miles away. And you have to say to yourself, why would you do that? Plus, you then got the so-called blue stones, which were brought from West Wales, some of which may well have formed part of a stone circle there, a place called Wainmorn. So why would you do this? Why would you just not use local stone to build a stone circle? And the idea that seems to be the solution to this is that they believed that there was spirit within these stones and that they could bring that spirit from one place to another by literally, hauling them from one place to another and then re-erecting them. And it seems as if there were originally 2 altar stones at Stonehenge, but we think they probably came from different places. Now, some of my colleagues suggest that the other one may have come from South Wales. I favour another part of Scotland, so that one came from northeastern Scotland, the other one came from the western part of the country, and that they were brought to Stonehenge. They were erected in the middle because they represented the ancestors, probably part of some kind of cosmological tradition to do with twins, which are found again and again in a lot of cosmogonies, particularly in Northern Europe, for instance. And I think that you've got something similar happening at Gobekli Tepe as well. Yeah. You have these 2 huge pillars, which the archaeologists today want to say, well, they're just roof supports. They mean nothing at all.
That's the twins.
But no, I'm sorry, that's not right in my opinion. What you're dealing with here is cosmological twins. I've talked about this, I think, probably first book, Gobekli Tepe, Genesis of Gods, that the idea of cosmological twins is something that, again, is almost universal. And I can't see any reason why it wouldn't have been brought into the construction of Tash Tepe, and that the 2 central pillars represent these twins, whether they're one's female, one's male, or they're both male, we don't know.
That's really cool. The twins founded the Taj Tepe. They founded Rome. They founded
there you go. Yeah,
the Inca, and then the Epic of Gilgamesh and Enkidu.
Yeah,
they're everywhere. I love that. That's cool.
Gemini.
Wow.
I have one more question.
I do too.
We've been going almost 2 hours here. This has been amazing. But we visited Avebury. You lived there for a while, right? Hugh pointed out your house when we were there.
I'm sure he did. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if you want to hire it out, it's an Airbnb now. So,
I'd love to stay there.
A stone circle in the back garden. I mean, because there was actually a standing stone that was, in our back garden that had been broken up and hidden under the ground. And when they built a conservatory, they obviously dug the foundations and found all the stones. So they got it up and put it inside a shed at the back of the garden. So I got all those pieces out and I created my own stone circle, actually in the centre of the big stone circle.
Excellent.
So I believe that's still there to this day.
Very cool,
man.
Yeah, we'll have to stay there next time we go. Yeah, I loved that place. That place was special.
House. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, it's a great place.
We felt a deep connection to that landscape, and I just wanted to ask you, having lived there for so long, and you've also seen Gobekli Tepe and these other places, do you think there is there some kind of similarity in the mind of the builders of these places? You think something similar is going on? It's cosmological.
Well, I mean, this is the big question. This is actually one of the questions I'm going to be answering in the next book I'm doing.
All right.
What is the relationship between, let's say, Stonehenge, which we know was constructed around 3000 BC, and let's say Gobekli Tepe was constructed in 9600 BC. So what's that? 6,600 years earlier. And quite clearly the obvious answer is, well, clearly there can't be a connection because they're in different time frames of history. But if you start tracing back the origins of Tash Tepe, and if you start looking at it as coming out of the area of Siberia, Mongolia, in other words, beyond the Ural Mountains into Siberia, and then start looking at the origins of Stonehenge, because Stonehenge was built by a culture called the Grooveware people, and they came down originally from the Orkney Islands of Scotland, where they emerged around 3200 BC. But they themselves were part of a much earlier Mesolithic culture that existed in that area. And the stone tools associated with their culture associate them with Northern Europe, places like Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, even Scandinavia. And the people that created those stone tools originally came from the Ural Mountains and beyond in Siberia. So in other words, you're talking really about migrational routes, one going on the north side of the Ural Mountains into northern Europe and then eventually into Scotland and then down into southern Britain. And then you've got another wave of activity, which is coming like southwestwards into the likes of Anatolia, where eventually it will create Tash Tepe. So the connection is essentially indirect. But if you look at Stonehenge now, in the recreations I've been doing for a new article I'm publishing over the next couple of days, where you have these two central pillars, and then you start looking at Gobekli Tepe, it's quite clear that they're the same ideas. You know, this idea of the cosmological twins being represented by two separate monoliths is exactly the same. And the other thing about Stonehenge is that even though the monument that we see today was only constructed between 3000 and 2000 BC, there was incredible activity on the site of Stonehenge going back at least to 8000 to 8500 BC, making it contemporary with Tash Tepe. And you know, the archaeologists working on Stonehenge have basically said that Stonehenge, they think, was the centre of Britain back in the late Neolithic, early Bronze Age. And that in their terms, is what they said, all roads led to Stonehenge back in that time. So, you know, in other words, Stonehenge is something that has evolved over a very long period of time, but has ideas that go back to the age of Tash Tepe.
Wow. Very cool. Okay, last question. Is there a massive government conspiracy to cover up whatever might be found over there in Turkey? You know what I mean? What's going on with the archaeology? Are they trying to not dig it up?
Well, look, okay, here's the thing. As you and many of your listeners, viewers will know, is that there's been videos put out saying certain things.
Yeah.
Firstly, that concrete is being poured all over Gobekli Tepe. Well, that's totally untrue. You know, the only concrete that's actually gone into the tepe itself, the hill itself, is the concrete that's gone around the bases of the huge support pillars for the roof.
Yes.
Right, and they were fully excavated first. The road that they're talking about with the concrete, that's completely off-site. That doesn't come anywhere near the actual site itself. The other thing about the conspiracy about trees being built on Gobekli so that the archaeologists cannot...
Yeah, the olive trees.
Excavate the olive trees. The olive trees were put there roughly around 2004 by the family that owns the land, and they did it for a very specific reason, to raise the price of that land in the knowledge that one day they would have to sell it to the government. And apparently, if you have trees, particularly olive trees, on land, it's worth far more money than if you just have a ploughed field. So that was a strategic move done by the family. And I've triple checked this, you know, with the family themselves. So that's not part of a conspiracy.
The other thing I would point out about olive trees is that they're very shallow roots. So they're just barely disturbing the surface. So anyways,
that's the other thing, is that, you know, obviously that the trees were, you know, destroying archaeology. I didn't know that, I'll be honest, but that's good news then. That means that hopefully at some point they can be removed and the archaeology can continue. The other story is that no archaeology will be going on there for 150 years because they want to cover up whatever secrets will be revealed. Again, that's just not true. I mean, firstly, yes, there is this philosophy amongst archaeologists that the next generation or the generation after that will have better techniques.
Yes.
You know, to be able to examine sites and the soil and the pollen and whatever else. So yes, that's there. So some sites are kept, you know, for future generations. But at Gobekli, even though it was left for several years that there was no work done whatsoever, in the past 2 years they've been exploring the areas of the southeastern depression, you know, the familiar enclosures that we know, A, B, C, and D. They've been working on B all this this year, this particular season, and finding some interesting stuff. It was Enclosure D last year, and I happen to know that they're opening up new sites, new excavations, new trenches in new positions at Gobekli next year. So obviously we look forward to that. The other thing, of course, is that the World Economic Forum has taken control of Gobekli Tepe and, part of their evil plan to control humanity in the future. Well, I mean, look, there's a company called Dogos, and they are, they've made their money from oil, basically. You're one of the richest companies in Turkey. They put in X amount of millions into creating the roofs at the site. They gave the minibuses. They created the visitor centre. And yes, they are members of the WEF. But so is Coca-Cola or Google or anybody else.
Yeah.
So I don't really see that as meaning necessarily that the WEF have got any influence on Gobekli Tepe. I mean, yes, they made a nice model of Gobekli Tepe that was at one of the Davos meetings a few years ago, but I don't really think that that's got anything more to do with other than the prestige of the Dogos group, saying, look, we're investigating the oldest temples in the world.
It's cool.
And it's a tax write-off.
Yeah. I mean, of course it is.
And I will say that they built a fantastic roof structure over that site. I mean, it's a really
it's all right.
Nice. I'm just saying it's well done. I mean, like you go to Egypt.
It's better than Çatalhöyük anyway. Çatalhöyük is horrible. Have you ever been there? Oh my God. It's so hot inside and you just want to get out. I mean, it's ruined the whole atmosphere there.
Yeah. But, I think they did a good job.
I mean, I am sad that we no longer will get any photos of the pillars with the sky in the background, and that every picture you take of Gobekli Tepe is this same orange. It's this color, because of the roof.
Well, you got to have some good filters on your camera, basically.
but the roof is good.
Dude, in contrast, and I think this is important if we're going to end this, is to talk about Karahan, because Nesmi Carroll and his team are speeding through the excavations there. I mean, at a hell of a rate. There is no idea at all of them wanting to sort of slow up. I mean,
awesome.
the rate that they are uncovering stuff there, and at the new site called Sayburj, which is just a few miles to the west of Şanlıurfa, which incredible stuff is coming out there right now. I mean, they want to know. They want to know what's there. Plus, the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism realise just how important this is to tourism.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they want to open up all of these Taş Tepe sites in the future, virtually to a sort of like a grand tour.
You got me excited.
From one to the other. Now, I mean, that's good and bad. I mean, good because it'll introduce it to more people. Bad because they're going to create more horrible roofs, basically. And we certainly know that next year they're going to be doing that to Karahan Tepe. But in addition to a roof, they are also going to install a glass walkway. Now, that sort of sounds okay, because what you'll be doing is you'll be walking over like a glass floor, but it'll have presumably glass on either side, presumably, I don't know. But the worry is, and this is something that my colleague, Hugh Newman, your good friend, is concerned about, is that the alignment towards the midwinter solstice that comes in through that porthole stone and hits the head. If they build a roof, they could completely destroy that. And nobody will ever get a chance to see that in the future.
Yeah.
Well, let's hope the roofs get better and have shutters and other things. I don't know. Look, we live.
It's weird, isn't it?
We live. We live in limestone hills, eroded limestone hills, and let me tell you, I've seen just over the years of living here what our limited rains and floods can do to this limestone, and it just tears it up. So. I don't have a problem with the cover. Yes, it sucks that we can't look at the night sky, but perhaps they can fix that with some surveying data points, and then we can get some 3D models we can look at. I don't know.
Yeah.
But
they're doing that already.
Glad to hear that. I like your view on this conspiracy theory stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah,
really appreciate that.
You know, I mean, if there are answers and they suitably resolve, you know, conspiracy ideas like that, then fine. Is there a conspiracy there? Not really. The only thing is that obviously people like myself and Hugh and Graham Hancock, who have been so vocal about these sites and our ideas, I don't think it's any, secret to say that the archaeologists are not that happy with us, in all honesty. You know, they want to be the ones that control the release of any information on any imagery or any documentaries to do with these sites, so that, you know, quite clearly, you know, I think that others would like to have written a book called Karahan Tepe first. You know what I mean? You know, and also I wrote a book called Gobekli Tepe, clearly, you know, everything about that site as well. But we're going to do that. I mean, this is what's happened for hundreds of years. I mean, when, you know, Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered, you know, it took Howard Carter years to put together, you know, his books on it. So clearly others were writing books on Tutankhamun because there was a demand for it. You know, and of course they were Egyptologists who weren't necessarily directly connected with the discovery itself, but knew enough about, you know, the Egyptological field and the discoveries being made to be able to bring out their books and have them on the bookshelves before, you know, Howard Carter. So this has been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, man, this has been awesome. Thank you so much. Can you, why don't you tell people where they can find all your stuff?
Yep.
Yeah.
Get in touch with you.
I mean, if you want to come to Karahan Tepe, I mean, look, Gobekli Tepe is open all the time. I mean, you pay something like €26 or something to get into it now. It's exorbitant. But obviously we do the tours twice a year, me and you, as part of Megalithomania. So we're going out there next May to all these sites, Sayburj, Karahan, Gobekli, and, you know, other Tash Tepe sites if we can possibly get permission to go to them. So we're doing that in May and September. All the details are on my site, andrewcollins.com, or on Hugh's site, megalithomania.co.uk. And I mean, if you want to see Karahan in the near future, I seriously suggest you get out there before, I'm going to say, July, August next year, because that's when they're starting to talk about doing that roof. And I suspect that once that begins, it will be closed for a year. I mean, Gobekli was closed for a year and a half when they were putting those roofs on. I mean, I actually went there during it. I actually was able to get it, and it looked like a complete mess. I mean, it was incredible. I mean, there were just iron girders. I mean, it was just everywhere. You know, contract your diggers and things. It was just all over the place. You thought, how the hell are they going to sort this mess out? But they did. So, you know. But let's just keep our fingers crossed that whatever they do at Karahan is even better than what they did at Gobekli. And of course, please buy my book, Karahan Tepe, Civilization of the Annunaki and the Cosmic Origins of the Serpent of Eden. The publisher likes long titles because it's got lots of meta tags in it, obviously. So yeah, if you're interested in what we're talking about, you know, that you can email me through the website, or please find me on social media. I'm on all of that. All the links for all of it is on the opening page of the website.
All right.
Awesome.
If you send me all that, any of the links and everything you want, I'll put them all in the show notes too, and people can go right now and look and find any of the links there. So
brilliant.
Thank you so much, Mr. Collins. This has been fascinating.
Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers.